Cadence Thorne's scream pierced the morning air as iron shackles bit into her wrists. The auctioneer's gavel striking would like a death knell, sold to Mayor Grimwald for $50. The crowd of leering men dispersed, their dirty coins already counting her future in servitude. But one figure remained motionless at the edge of the square Jericho cane. His weathered hands clenched around his horse's reins until his knuckles turned white. He'd ridden into Mercy Falls 3 days ago, another nameless drifter seeking work and whiskey, but everything changed the moment he saw her scrubbing floors in the saloon. Cadence moved like trapped lightning, her amber eyes holding a fire that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. When their gazes met across the smoky room, something ancient and inevitable passed between them. Recognition of 2 souls carved from the same rebellious stone. Now she belonged to Grimwald, the town's most powerful man and its cruelest. The mayor's plantation house squatted on the hill like a diseased spider, and everyone knew what happened to the girls he bought. They worked his fields by day and warmed his bed by night until they either died from exhaustion or found themselves dancing at the end of a rope for some fabricated crime. Jericho's jaw tightened as Grimwald's men dragged Cadence toward a wagon. She fought them every step, her cotton dress tearing as she twisted and kicked. Blood trickled from her split lip where one of them had struck her, but her eyes blazed with unbroken defiance. When she looked back at the crowd, her gaze found his, and in that moment, he saw something that made his chest constrict hope. "You got business here, stranger?" Sheriff Donovan materialized beside him, badge gleaming dully in the harsh sunlight. The lawman's reputation preceded him Grimwald's dog. They called him bought and paid for, like everything else in this godforsaken town. "Just passing through," Jericho replied, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. He'd killed men for less than what he'd witnessed today. But charging in now would only get them both killed. Donovan studied him with pig-small eyes. "Then I suggest you keep passing. We don't take kindly to drifters who overstay their welcome."
The wagon
creaked away, carrying Cadence toward the plantation. She craned her neck to look back one final time, and Jericho saw her mouth move silently. "Help me." That night, in the shadows of his camp outside town, Jericho cleaned his guns with methodical precision. He'd spent 15 years running from his past, from the blood on his hands and the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But seeing Cadence sold like cattle had awakened something he thought he'd buried forever, the part of him that still believed some things were worth fighting for. Thunder rumbled overhead as he checked his ammunition. 3 days. According to the saloon girls, Grimwald always gave his new acquisitions 3 days to adjust before the real nightmare began. 3 days to plan, to position himself, to become death itself if necessary. The rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air but not the determination from his heart. Cadence Thorne would not break under Grimwald's hands, not while Jericho Kane still drew breath. Rain drummed against the plantation house windows as Cadence pressed her ear to the locked door of her prison, small room in Grimwald's attic, where previous acquisitions had carved their names into the wooden walls like epitaphs. Outside, thunder masked the sound of her fingernails scraping mortar from between the stones near the window. She'd rather die falling than submit to what awaited her. Grimwald hadn't touched her yet, preferring to let fear marinate his victims before the feast, but Cadence had learned long ago that fear was just another cage, and she'd spent her life breaking free from cages. When her father died owing debts to half the territory, she'd sold herself rather than watch her younger brother starve. The choice had been hers then, and the choice to fight would be hers now. 2 floors below, Jericho crouched in Grimwald's study, rifling through ledgers by lamplight. He'd slipped past the guards using skills learned in darker days when he'd been more shadow than man. The mayor's records painted a picture of systematic corruption, bribes paid, women bought, witnesses silenced. But what made Jericho's blood turn to ice was the final entry in the current ledger. C. Thorne disposal scheduled sunrise. 4th day, disposal. As if she were refused to be discarded. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jericho melted back into the shadows as Grimwald entered, still dressed despite the late hour. The mayor was a mountain of a man, soft with privilege, but dangerous as a cornered boar. He poured whiskey with shaking hands, and Jericho realized the bastard was nervous about something. "Sheriff says there's a drifter asking questions in town." Grimwald muttered to himself, then louder, "Garrett." A scarred man emerged from the adjoining room. "Yes, sir. They're at a watch tonight. Move the girl to the cellar. If someone's sniffing around, I want her where screams can't be heard." Jericho's hand found his knife handle. One quick thrust and Grimwald would never hurt another soul. But the sound of struggle would bring guards running, and Cadence would die before he could reach her. Patience. The hardest lesson of his violent life, but the most valuable. Garrett nodded and headed for the stairs. Jericho counted to 30, then followed like death's whisper. The cellar reeked of mold and older horrors. Cadence stood chained to the wall, her dress torn but her spine straight. She'd managed to work one hand partially free. The girl was tougher than rawhide. When she saw Garrett approaching with his key, she smiled with bitter sweetness. "Come to sample the merchandise before your boss?" she asked, voice steady as mountain stone. Garrett grinned, revealing rotted teeth. "Maybe I am. Who's gonna stop?" "Me, I am," Jericho said, stepping from the shadows. Garrett spun, hand diving for his gun, but Jericho's blade found his throat first. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, then vacant with death. He crumpled without a sound. Cadence stared at her rescuer, this ghost from the auction square who'd materialized like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. "You came," she whispered. "I gave my word," Jericho replied, working at her shackles with Garrett's keys. "Can you ride like the wind itself?" The chains fell away. Above them, floorboards creaked as guards made their rounds. Dawn was still hours away, but their window of opportunity was closing fast. Jericho had left 2 horses tied in the woods beyond the plantation, but first they had to cross 100 yards of open ground, patrolled by armed men. "There's something you should know," Cadence said, as they prepared to leave. "Grimwald doesn't just buy girls for himself. He sells them to other men, ships them downriver to places where screaming never stops. He's got 12 others locked up in the barn." Jericho closed his eyes. 12 more souls crying out for salvation. 12 more reasons why walking away wasn't an option. "Then we save them all," said. The barn stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky like a monument to suffering, its weathered boards hiding horrors that made strong men weep. Jericho crouched in the tall grass beside Cadence, counting guards and calculating angles of attack. For men patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung carelessly across their shoulders. They weren't expecting trouble from locked-up women. "The key's on a hook inside the door," Cadence whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Grimwald showed me when he threatened to put me with the others if I didn't behave." Thunder rumbled overhead, and Jericho smiled grimly. The storm would provide cover, but it also meant muddy ground that could betray their movements. Checked his pistol one final time, 6 shots, 4 guards, and whatever waited inside. The mathematics of violence, calculated in heartbeats and powder burns. "When I move, you circle around to the horses," he instructed. "If this goes wrong, it won't," Cadence interrupted, her amber eyes fierce in the darkness. "I'm not leaving without those girls." Before he could argue, she was moving, slipping through the grass like smoke given form. The woman had nerves of tempered steel and the reflexes of a wildcat. Jericho found himself admiring her, even as terror clawed at his chest, not for himself, but for her. Somewhere between the auction block and this moment, she'd become more precious to him than his own life. The first guard died quietly, Jericho's knife sliding between his ribs like a key turning in a lock. The second turned at the soft thud, his companion hitting the ground, mouth opening to shout a warning that became a gurgle as steel found his throat. 2 shots cracked across the night as the remaining guards spotted movement. But Jericho was already rolling, returning fire with deadly precision. Silence fell like a curtain, broken only by the drum of rain on the barn roof. Jericho found the key where Cadence had promised, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the heavy door. What he found inside made him understand why some men turned to drink to forget. 12 women, ages ranging from barely 16 to perhaps 30, chained. 2 posts like animals awaiting slaughter. Some sobbed at his appearance, others stared with eyes that had seen too much. A few couldn't look up at all, their spirits broken beyond repair. But one, a red-haired girl with freckles and fire in her green eyes, lifted her chin defiantly. "You here to use us or free us?" she demanded. "Free you," Jericho replied, working at her chains. "Name's Jericho Kane. We're getting you out of here." "Molly Sinclair," she replied, "and about damn time someone showed up." As he freed each woman, Jericho's rage grew like a living thing in his chest. Some bore fresh bruises, others old scars that spoke of systematic cruelty. These weren't criminals or debtors, they were daughters and sisters, stolen from lives that should have been filled with laughter and love. Cadence appeared in the doorway, leading a string of horses she'd somehow liberated from Grimwald's stable. "Company's coming," she announced, pointing toward the main house where lanterns blazed and angry voices carried on the wind. "Grimwald's awake and he's bringing friends." Jericho helped the last woman to her feet, a girl so young she should have been playing with dolls instead of wearing shackles. "Can everyone ride?" he asked. Molly answered for the group. "We'll learn fast or die trying. Either's better than staying here." They moved as one toward the waiting horses, these broken women finding strength in numbers and hope in the storm-dark night. But as they reached the animals, torchlight blazed across the yard, and Grimwald's voice boomed through the rain. "Thought you could steal from me, did you?" The mayor stood flanked by a dozen armed men, his face twisted with rage. "Should've minded your own business, Drifter. Now you'll watch them all hang before we put a rope around your neck?" Jericho stepped forward, positioning himself between the women and the guns. His own pistol felt heavy in his hand, 6 shots against 12 men. It's impossible odds, but he'd faced worse and lived to tell about it. "Only hanging happening tonight is yours, Grimwald," he called back. "These women are leaving. Question is, whether you die trying to stop them, or step aside and live to see another sunrise." The mayor's laughter echoed off the barn walls like the bray of a mad donkey. Big words from a dead man. "Boys, kill the Drifter and bring me back my property." Lightning split the sky as guns rose on both sides, illuminating faces twisted with determination and fear. The mathematics of violence had shifted. Jericho Kane had never been good at running from impossible fights. The first shot came from Grimwald's left flank, a rifle crack that split the night like a whip. Jericho dove sideways, rolling behind a water trough as bullets chewed splinters from the barn wall. Behind him, the women scattered for cover, but he could hear Cadence shouting orders, organizing them with the tactical precision of a seasoned fighter. "Spread out. Use the horses for cover, Molly. Take 3 girls and circle left. There's a gap in their line." Thunder masked the sound of hoofbeats as some of the women mounted up and spurred their horses toward freedom. Others, too weak or injured to ride hard, crouched behind anything solid they could find. Jericho counted muzzle flashes aid men, still firing, which meant he'd wounded or killed 4 in the opening exchange. A figure detached from Grimwald's group, moving to flank the water trough. Jericho recognized him as Deputy Marshal Crenshaw, a federal lawman who'd sold his badge to the highest bidder years ago. The man's reputation with a gun was legendary in 3 territories, and he moved with the fluid confidence of a professional killer. "Hello, Kane," Crenshaw called, his voice cutting through the storm. "Heard you'd gone soft, riding to rescue fallen doves like some kind of knight. Shame to see a good gun go to waste on sentiment." Jericho peered around the trough's edge. Crenshaw stood 20 yards away, coat whipping in the wind, hands loose at his sides. Other men had stopped shooting, recognizing the ritual about to unfold. Even Grimwald held his fire. Everyone knew the marshal's reputation. Nothing soft about pudding. "Down rabid dogs," Jericho replied, rising to his feet. Water streamed from his hat brim as he faced the deputy, their eyes meeting across the muddy yard. Should have stayed bought. "Crenshaw, now you die for 30 pieces of silver." The marshal smiled, teeth white in the lightning's glare. "Fast. As you were, Kane, I was always faster. Time to prove it." They drew together, 2 professionals whose paths had finally crossed in violence. Crenshaw's gun cleared leather like striking lightning. "Ah!" But Jericho's hand moved with the memory of 100 similar duels. Muscle and bone trained to respond faster than thought itself. The shots came so close together, they sounded like one. Crenshaw staggered, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest with almost scholarly interest. His gun fell from nerveless fingers as he toppled forward into the mud. "Impossible," he whispered, then said nothing more. Grimwald's roar of rage shattered the momentary silence. "Kill them all! Burn the barn with the bitches inside!" But his men's enthusiasm had died with Crenshaw. Facing an angry mayor was one thing. Standing against the man who'd just outdrew the fastest gun in 3 territories was another entirely. They began backing away, some openly fleeing into the night. That's when Cadence made her move. She'd worked her way around to the mayor's blind side, while everyone watched the duel. And now she emerged from the shadows like an avenging angel. Her stolen knife found the gap between Grimwald's ribs before he knew she was there. Sliding home with surgical precision, the mayor's eyes went wide with shock, then fury. He spun, massive hands reaching for her throat, but the blade had done its work. Blood frothed on his lips as he collapsed, his reign of terror ending in the mud beside his hired killer. The remaining guards scattered like leaves before a hurricane, their loyalty extending only as far as their employers continued breathing. Within minutes, the yard was empty except for the dead and the living they'd tried to destroy. Jericho holstered his smoking pistol and turned to survey their group. Some of the women had vanished into the night on horseback, Molly and her companions, seeking whatever freedom they could find in the darkness. Others remained too injured or traumatized to travel far without help. "There's a town called Haven's Rest, about 50 miles north," he told them. "Good people there, folks who will help you start over without asking too many questions." "What about you?" Cadence asked, wiping Grimwald's blood from her hands. Rain had washed most of the gore from her face, but her eyes still held the cold fire of recent violence. Jericho looked at the bodies littering the yard, then at the women they'd freed. Part of him wanted to ride away, to lose himself on distant trails where the past couldn't follow. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger since he first saw Cadence's defiant amber eyes, wanted something different. "Reckon. That depends," he said slowly, "on whether a certain woman might want company on the road north." The abandoned cabin squatted in a grove of pine trees like a forgotten prayer. Its roof half collapsed, but its walls still strong enough to provide shelter. Jericho had found it 2 days into their journey north, when it became clear that several of the rescued women couldn't travel much farther without rest and medical attention. Cadence knelt beside the youngest girl, Iris, barely 17, who'd been sold to pay her family's debts. Fever burned in the child's eyes, and infection had set into wounds that spoke of unspeakable cruelties. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that tore at Jericho's heart. "She needs a real doctor," Cadence whispered, her voice thick with worry. "And medicine we don't have." Through the cabin's broken window, Jericho could see the other women they'd brought with them. 8 souls, too broken or injured to strike out on their own, each carrying scars that would never fully heal. They'd built a small fire despite the risk, more for comfort than warmth, and sat staring into the flames like pilgrims seeking visions. "Bartonville's only 10 miles east," he said quietly, "as a doctor supplies everything she needs." "And a sheriff who might recognize us from wanted posters," Cadence replied. Word of Grimwald's death would have spread by now, along with descriptions of the murderous drifter and his accomplice who'd killed a mayor and federal marshal. The truth rarely traveled as fast as profitable lies. Jericho checked his pocket. Watch an heirloom from his father, one of the few decent memories from a childhood best forgotten. 3 in the morning, that darkest hour when hope burned lowest and death came calling most often. Iris whimpered in her delirium, calling for a mother who would never answer. "I'll go," he decided, alone. Less suspicious that way. Cadence's hand closed over his wrist, her fingers surprisingly strong. "And if you don't come back? If they're waiting for you?" The question hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. In the 3 days since their escape from Grimwald's plantation, something had changed between them, the desperate alliance of survival slowly transforming into something deeper, more dangerous to hearts that had learned not to trust. "Then you take the others and keep heading north," he said. "Don't look back, don't mourn me, just live, like hell." Her amber eyes blazed with familiar defiance. We go together, or not at all? Before he could argue, one of the other women spoke from the shadows. It was Elena, a Mexican girl whose English came flavored with the music of her homeland. She'd been the strongest of their group, helping the others when her own injury should have left her bedridden. "There is another way," she said, rising to approach them. "My cousin Miguel, he has a ranch near Bartonville. Good man, hates the sheriffs and their corruption. He would help us." "How do we know we can trust him?" Jericho asked. Elena's smile was sad, but genuine. "Because they took his daughter, too. 6 months ago, sold her south to a brothel in El Paso. He has been looking for a way to strike back ever since." Hope kindled in the darkness like a match flame in wind, fragile but real. Jericho had learned to be suspicious of hope, but sometimes it was all that stood between survival and surrender. "Can you find his place?" he asked. "Sir, even in the dark, we played there as children." They prepared to move Iris and the others. Cadence pulled Jericho aside. The cabin's shadows seemed to embrace them, creating a pocket of intimacy in the midst of their desperate flight. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when we get them all to safety, what then?" He studied her face in the dim light, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the stubborn set of her jaw. 3 days ago, she'd been a stranger at an auction block. Now she felt like the other half of his soul, the missing piece he'd never known he was searching for. "I've been running for 15 years, he admitted. "From things I did, people I hurt, choices that can't be undone." "Stop running. And maybe it's time someone ran toward something instead of away from it," she replied, her hand finding his in the darkness through the cabin's broken roof. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns older than human memory. Somewhere, in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the night sky, and Jericho thought he understood that sound better than most. But for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in answering it. They loaded Iris carefully onto a makeshift stretcher and began the journey to Miguel's ranch. 8 women and 1 man moving through the darkness like ghosts seeking redemption. Behind them lay death and vengeance. Ahead waited uncertain salvation. But sometimes uncertainty was better than the certain. It's despair they'd left behind. Miguel Herrera's ranch emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like a mirage of hope. Its adobe, walls gleaming pale in the starlight. The man himself stood waiting in the yard as if he'd been expecting the mal-weathered figure in his 50s. With silver threading his black hair and eyes that held the depth of old pain, "Elena," he said softly, embracing his cousin with the careful tenderness of someone who understood broken things. "I heard what happened in Mercy Falls. The whole territory's talking about the drifter who killed Mayor Grimwald." "This is him," Elena replied, nodding toward Jericho. "And this is Cadence, who put the knife in that bastard's heart." Miguel studied them both with the measuring gaze of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded and gestured toward the house. "Bring the sick one inside. My wife Rosa, she knows healing. The others can rest in the bunkhouse. It's clean and safe." As they carried Iris into the warmth of the adobe house, Jericho felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in days. The interior spoke of love and care, hand-woven blankets on the furniture, the lingering scent of Rosa's cooking, family photographs that showed a life built on hope rather than fear. Rosa Herrera proved to be a small woman with gentle hands. In fierce determination, she took one look at Iris and began issuing orders in rapid Spanish, gathering herbs and clean cloth with the efficiency of someone who'd tended many wounds. Within an hour, the girl's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully for the first time since their escape. "She will live," Rosa announced, wiping her hands on her apron. "But she needs rest, good food, time to heal inside, as well as outside." Dawn painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Jericho found Miguel standing by the corral, watching a mare nuzzle her colt with infinite patience. The rancher's weathered hands gripped the fence rails until his knuckles showed white. "They took my Isabella 6 months ago," Miguel said without preamble. 17 years old, beautiful as morning light. The sheriff claimed she'd stolen money from the bank, but everyone knew it was a lie. She was just ... convenient. "Where is she now?" Jericho asked. "El Paso, working in a brothel called the Silver Palace. I've tried to buy her freedom, but the owner knows I'll pay anything. The price keeps rising. Adele's voice cracked like old leather. Last week, he told me she was sick. Won't say with what, but I can guess. The mathematics of revenge were simple: take from those who had taken from you. But the mathematics of rescue were more complex, requiring planning, patience, and often sacrifice. Jericho had become expert in both forms of calculation. How much does he want now? He asked. $800. Might as well be $8,000 for all I can raise. Jericho thought of the money belt hidden in his saddlebags, $2,000 in gold. Payment for a job he'd completed in Colorado before riding into Mercy Falls. Blood money earned through violence. But perhaps it could purchase something clean for once. I'll get your daughter back, he said quietly. Miguel turned to stare at him, hope and disbelief warring in his dark eyes. Why? You don't know me. Don't owe me anything. 'Cause some debts aren't about money, Jericho replied, thinking of Cadence and the women they'd freed. And because a man who'd shelter strangers at risk to himself deserves better than watching his daughter die in a whorehouse. That afternoon, as the rescued women rested and healed under Ross's care, Jericho sat with Cadence on the ranch house porch. She'd cleaned up, trading her torn dress for clothes. Rosa had provided a simple blue skirt and white blouse that made her amber eyes seem to glow. You're planning something dangerous, she said. It wasn't a question. Miguel's daughter needs help. The Silver Palace isn't the kind of place that releases its merchandise easily. Then we go together, she said firmly, like everything else we've done. Jericho shook his head. This isn't like the plantation. El Paso's a big city, lots of law, lots of witnesses. Person can slip in and out without notice. 2 leaves twice the tracks, and if something goes wrong, if you don't come back. He reached into his shirt and pulled out his father's pocket watch, pressing it into her hands. The gold was warm from his body heat, and she could feel the steady tick of its mechanism against her palm. Then you'll know I kept faith with what we started, he said. Take the others north to Haven's Rest. Help them build new lives. Live your own life free, the way you were meant to. Cadence closed her fingers around the watch, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Jericho Kane, you're either the most noble fool I've ever met or the most foolish noble man. Maybe both, he admitted, then leaned over to kiss her forehead with infinite gentleness. But either way, I love you, Cadence Thorne. Wanted you to know that before I ride south, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, 2 hearts learned what it meant to love something more precious than their own lives. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new choices, new chances for redemption or ruin, but tonight, they had each other and the promise of a future worth fighting for. The Silver Palace crouched on El Paso's main street, like a painted whore pretending to be a lady, its false facade hiding the rot within. Jericho had been watching it for 2 days, learning the rhythms of its business, the flow of customers, the changing of guards, the brief moments when opportunity might present itself. Isabella Herrera was there, he'd confirmed that much. Girl with her father's eyes, working the saloon floor with the mechanical smile of someone whose spirit had been systematically murdered. She couldn't be more than 17. But her face held the hollow look of a woman who'd seen too much of humanity's darkest appetites. The owner, a corpulent man named Valdez, kept his most valuable merchandise under close watch. Isabella never left the building alone, never strayed from the assigned areas, never looked up when customers entered. But Jericho had seen her hands scarred from rope burns where she'd tried to escape, still moving in small gestures of prayer when she thought no one was watching. On the 3rd night, he made his move. The alley behind the palace reeked of rotting garbage and broken dreams. Jericho scaled the building's rear wall with the silent grace of a professional, using handholds he'd memorized during his surveillance. The 2nd-floor window opened to Isabella's room, a cramped space barely large enough for a bed, and who? She was waiting for him. "You're the man my father sent," she whispered in Spanish, her voice barely audible above the raucous laughter from the saloon below. "Alina got word to me through one of the other girls." "Can you travel?" he asked, noting the fresh bruises on her arms, and the way she favored her left side. "I can do whatever I must to leave this place," she replied with fierce determination that reminded him of Cadence. "But Valdez will notice I'm gone within the hour. He checks on his special girls regularly." Jericho had anticipated this problem. From his coat, he withdrew a small vial of colorless liquid laudanum mixed with ipecac, enough to simulate serious illness without permanent harm. "Drink this," he instructed. "In 10 minutes, you'll be vomiting and running a fever. They'll think you're too sick to work, maybe even contagious. Should buy us until morning." Isabella took the vial without hesitation, downing its contents in one swallow. "My father taught me to trust my instincts about people," she said. "They tell me you're a good man doing bad things for good reasons." "Your father's a wise man," Jericho replied. "And you're his daughter?" The laudanum worked exactly as planned. Within minutes, Isabella was doubled over with violent retching, her skin flushed and burning with artificial fever. When Valdez came to check on the disturbance, he took one look at her condition and ordered the room locked and fumigated. "Probably the cholera," he muttered to his bodyguard. "Keep everyone away until morning. Can't afford to lose the whole house to sickness." As soon as their footsteps faded, Jericho emerged from his hiding place behind the wardrobe. Isabella was still pale and shaking from the drug's effects, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Can you ride?" he asked. I can fly if it means getting away from here," she whispered. They climbed down the rear wall together, Isabella moving with the desperate strength of someone who knows this chance might never come again. In the alley, 2 horses waited Jericho's faithful gelding and a mare he'd purchased with Miguel's gold, along with supplies for the long ride north. As they mounted up, a shout echoed from the palace's upper floors. Deception earlier than expected, and now angry voices were coordinating a search. Lanterns blazed in windows as Valdez's men poured into the streets. "They're faster than I thought they'd be," Jericho muttered, spurring his horse toward the town's northern edge. Behind them, the pursuit was all ready, for many a dozen riders led by Valdez himself, their faces twisted with rage at being cheated. "A valuable property," the fat man's voice carried on the night air. $500 to whoever brings them back alive. 1,000 if you kill the man and return the girl. But Jericho Kane had spent 15 years staying ahead of men who wanted him dead, and he knew every trick for disappearing into the vast Texas wilderness. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and creek beds that would confuse pursuing horses, doubling back when possible to muddy their tracks by dawn. They'd put 20 miles between themselves and El Paso with no sign of immediate pursuit. Isabella had proven herself a natural horsewoman, staying mounted despite her injuries and the lingering effects of the laudanum. When they finally stopped to rest by a hidden spring, she surprised him with a question. "The woman who was with you at my cousin's ranch, you love her, don't you?" Jericho nodded, suddenly understanding that love was no longer something to hide or deny, more than my own life. "Then why did you risk everything to save a stranger's daughter?" He thought of Cadence's amber eyes, of the women they'd freed from Grimwald's barn, of the choice between running away and running toward something worth saving. "Because she taught me that love isn't just about holding on to what's yours," he said finally. "Sometimes it's about letting go of what you are to become what you need to be." 3 days later, they rode into Miguel's ranch yard to find a celebration in progress. The rescued women had all recovered their strength under Rosa's care, and several had already departed for new lives in distant towns. But Cadence had remained, helping with the healing while waiting for news that might never come. When she saw Jericho riding toward the house with Isabella at his side, her face transformed with joy, so pure it made his chest tight with wonder. She ran to meet them, and when he dismounted, she threw herself into his arms with complete abandon. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered against his neck. "I knew you'd keep faith." Miguel's reunion with his daughter brought tears to eyes that hadn't wept in years. Father and child clung to each other in the ranch yard while Rosa sobbed happy prayers in rapid Spanish. The circle was complete, the debts paid, the promises kept. That evening, the celebration gave way to quiet conversation around the fire. Cadence found Jericho standing by the corral where it all began. She slipped her hand into his, their fingers interlacing like pieces of a puzzle finally solved. "So what now?" she asked. "The law is still looking for us? Wanted posters probably have our faces plastered across 3 territories by now." Jericho smiled, pulling his father's pocket watch from his vest. She'd returned it to him upon his safe arrival, though he'd seen her reluctance to let it go. "Miguel's offered us work here on the ranch. Good, honest labor, far enough from civilization that past sins might be forgotten. And you'd be content with that? Raising cattle and mending fences after the life you've lived?" He turned to face her fully, his weathered hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Cadence Thorne, I've spent 15 years running from who I was, trying to outrun the ghosts of men I've killed and choices I've made. But standing here with you, watching Isabella laugh with her father again, seeing those women we freed find hope in their eyes, I think maybe redemption isn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it's about building something better from the pieces that remain." She studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the scars and hard lines to the man beneath, someone who'd chosen love over vengeance, sacrifice over safety, time and again. "And if the law comes calling, our past catches up despite everything, then we face it together," he said simply. "No more running, no more hiding. Whatever comes, we meet it as partners." From the house came the sound of Isabella's laughter, pure and unbroken, mixing with her parents' voices in a symphony of reunion. Other sounds drifted on the evening air. Elena, teaching one of the rescued girls to play guitar. The gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night. The whisper of wind through pine trees that had stood sentinel over this land for decades. "Partners," Cadence repeated, tasting the word like honey. "I like the sound of that." As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel approached from the fire, his face creased with the kind of contentment that comes from answered prayers. "Forgive the interruption, but I wanted to speak with you both before you retire." "About the work?" Jericho asked. Miguel's smile was sly. "About the wedding." Both Jericho and Cadence stared at him in confusion. "Wedding," Cadence managed. "Perhaps I am presumptuous," Miguel chuckled. "But an old man learns to recognize love when he sees it. And Rosa, she has already begun planning the celebration. She says it has been too long since this ranch heard wedding bells, and she will not be denied the chance to cook for such an occasion." Jericho felt heat rise in his cheeks, a sensation he hadn't experienced since boyhood. "Miguel, we haven't even discussed, haven't we?" Cadence interrupted, her amber eyes dancing with mischief. "All this talk of partnerships and facing the future together, ... sounds like a proposal to me." "That wasn't Timeen. I would never presume," Jericho stammered, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy rather than a man who'd faced down professional killers. Cadence laughed, the sound like silver. Bells in the darkness. "Jericho Kane, for a man who can outdraw federal marshals and plan impossible rescues, well, you're remarkably tongue-tied when it comes to matters of the heart." She stepped closer, rising on her toes to whisper in his ear, "The answer is yes." "I haven't asked the question yet," he protested weakly. "Then ask it." The corral fell silent, except for the soft stamping of horses and the distant crackle of the fire. Even Miguel seemed to hold his breath as Jericho sank to one knee in the dust, his hands trembling as he reached for Cadence's fingers. "Cadence." "Thorne," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not a man who deserves happiness, but you make me want to try. Will you marry me? Will you help me build something good from the wreckage of what I've been? Only if you promise me something." In return, she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks, "Anything. Promise me that when our children ask about their parents, we can tell them stories of courage instead of shame. Promise me that the love we build will be stronger than the ghosts we carry." "I promise," he said, rising to kiss her with all the passion of a man who'd finally found his way home. 6 months later, under a canopy of autumn stars, they spoke vows that bound not just to hearts, but to souls that had found redemption in each other's arms. The rescued women attended as bridesmaids, Isabella served as maid of honor, and Miguel walked Cadence down an aisle carpeted with wildflowers. Rosa had scattered that morning. Father Martinez from the mission blessed their union in both English and Spanish, his words carrying across the ranch land like a benediction on all who had suffered and survived. When he pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by friends who understood that some love stories are written in blood and fire. Before they find their way to joy, years passed. The wanted posters faded, and new legends took their place in territorial newspapers. Jericho and Cadence Kane built a life of honest work and quiet happiness, their ranch becoming a refuge for travelers in need and women seeking fresh starts. They raised 3 children, too. Daughters with their mother's fierce amber eyes, and a son who inherited his father's steady hands and quiet strength. Sometimes, on nights when the wind was right, Jericho would tell his children stories of the old days, carefully edited tales of adventure and justice that emphasized honor over violence. And when they asked why he'd stopped being a gunfighter, he would look at their mother across the dinner table and smile. "Because I found something worth living for instead of just surviving," he would say. And sometimes that makes all the difference. The end. Theirs was a love story written not in the stars, but in the choices they made each day to trust instead of doubt, to build instead of destroy, to face tomorrow together instead of running from yesterday alone. The drifter had finally stopped drifting, and the souled girl had bought herself freedom with the only currency that mattered. The courage to love without reservation. They lived happily, fully, and completely, proof that even the most broken souls can find wholeness when they stop running toward the horizon and start building a home where they stand.